Autumn 1942, an intelligence briefing room in the Oberkommando der Heeres headquarters at Zossen, south of Berlin. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, chief of Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, stands before a map of the Soviet Union, pointer in hand. On the table before him lies a stack of reports, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and interrogation transcripts from captured Soviet officers. The generals seated around the table wait for what they assume will be routine information. The monthly estimate of Soviet armored strength. Gehlen clears his throat and reads a number that seems impossible. His analysts now believe the Soviets are producing approximately 1,000 tanks per month. Perhaps more. A moment of silence. Then General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, leans forward and asks Gehlen to repeat himself. Gehlen does. The silence stretches longer this time. Someone mutters that this cannot be correct. The factories in the Urals cannot possibly be operating at such capacity. The evacuation had been chaotic, incomplete. German bombers had struck key industrial centers. The Soviet workforce had been decimated by the invasion. And yet the numbers from the front told a different story. For every Soviet tank destroyed, 2 more seemed to appear. Entire armored brigades, supposedly annihilated in the encirclements of summer 1941, had somehow reconstituted themselves by spring. The T-34 seconds kept coming, endlessly, relentlessly. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What German High Command eventually learned about Soviet industrial capacity would reshape not only their strategy, but their understanding of the war itself. This is the story of how the Reich's military leadership confronted an industrial reality they had deemed impossible. How their intelligence failures compounded into strategic catastrophe. And how a nation they had dismissed as technologically backward outproduced them by margins that defied comprehension. To understand the shock that Soviet production figures inflicted upon German military planners, one must first understand what they expected. German intelligence assessments before Operation Barbarossa painted a picture of Soviet weakness. The Red Army had performed poorly against Finland in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940. Stalin's purges had decimated the officer corps. Soviet industry was deemed primitive, its workers unskilled, its managers incompetent. Most critically, German planners believed the campaign would be short. The Wehrmacht would destroy the bulk of Soviet forces in the western military districts within 8 to 10 weeks. Moscow would fall before winter. The remaining Soviet state, stripped of its European industrial heartland, would collapse or sue for peace. Under this assumption, detailed analysis of Soviet industrial potential seemed unnecessary. Why study the production capacity of factories you planned to capture or destroy? The Oberkommando des Heeres estimated that the Soviets possessed perhaps 10,000 tanks at the start of Barbarossa. Many of these were obsolete models, light tanks like the T-26 and BT series that German anti-tank guns could handle. The newer designs, the T-34 and KV-1, existed in small numbers, perhaps a few hundred at most. These estimates were catastrophically wrong. The Red Army actually deployed over 20,000 tanks along its western frontier in June 1941, including nearly 1,000 T-34 seconds and over 500 KV-1 second concentrated in just 5 of their 29 mechanized corps. But even these revised numbers, which German intelligence gradually discovered during the campaign's first months, represented only part of the miscalculation. The true shock came when the Wehrmacht encountered the T-34 inches combat. Prior to Barbarossa, German intelligence had no knowledge of this tank's existence. On the second day of the invasion, 23rd of June, 1941, German units met both the T-34 and KV-1 for the first time. The experience proved traumatic. German anti-tank crews watched in disbelief as their standard 37mm Pak 36 rounds bounced harmlessly off the T-34's sloped armor. At WWII in Lithuania, a single KV-1 heavy tank blocked a German advance for an entire day, shrugging off fire from multiple anti-tank guns and Panzer IEs before finally being knocked out by an 88mm anti-aircraft gun brought forward specifically for the task. The diary of General Alfred Jodl recorded the surprise at encountering what he termed this unknown wonder weapon being unleashed against German assault divisions. General Ewald von Kleist, commanding the 1st Panzer Group, called the T-34 the finest tank in the world, and General Heinz Guderian, Germany's foremost armoured warfare theorist and commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, acknowledged what he termed the vast superiority of Russian tanks. At Mutsensk, near Urals, in early October 1941, Guderian's 4th Panzer Division suffered a severe setback against Soviet forces equipped with T-34 seconds. The experience so alarmed Guderian that he demanded an immediate inquiry into tank warfare on the Eastern Front. He suggested the quickest solution might be to simply copy the T-34 directly. A special Panzer Commission arrived at the front on 20th of November 1941 to assess the captured Soviet tanks and determine how Germany might respond to this unexpected threat. Yet, even as German tank designers scrambled to develop counters to the T-34, a more fundamental problem was emerging. It was not merely that the Soviets possessed a superior tank design. It was that they possessed the industrial capacity to produce this superior design in quantities Germany could not match. In June 1941, when German forces poured across the Soviet frontier, they expected to capture or destroy the bulk of Soviet war industry. The major tank factories were located in the Western Soviet Union, in Kharkov, in Leningrad, in Stalingrad. German operational planning assumed these facilities would be neutralized within months. What German planners did not anticipate was the Soviet response. Beginning in July 1941, even as Wehrmacht forces advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, the Soviet government initiated one of the most remarkable industrial relocations in history. Over 1,500 major factories were dismantled, loaded onto railway cars, and shipped eastward beyond the Ural Mountains, out of reach of German bombers and ground forces. The scale of this evacuation defied imagination. Entire factory complexes were broken down into their component parts, packed onto trains stretching dozens of kilometers, and reassembled in the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. Nearly 16 million workers and their families accompanied this exodus, enduring weeks in overcrowded railway cars, arriving at destinations that often lacked basic housing or infrastructure. The Kirov factory from Leningrad, one of the Soviet Union's premier heavy manufacturing facilities, was evacuated to Chelyabinsk beginning in autumn 1941, even as German forces closed the ring around the city. Over 15,000 workers and their families were airlifted out of the besieged city and transported by train to the Urals. There they merged with the Chelyabinsk tractor plant and relocated elements from the Kharkov diesel factory to create what became known as Tankograd, Tank City. This improvised industrial complex began producing KV heavy tanks within weeks of its establishment. Workers assembled machinery in open fields before factory buildings were even completed. In temperatures reaching 40 degrees below zero, men and women labored around the clock, often sleeping beside their machines to maximize production time. By January 1942, roughly 30,000 people worked at Tankograd. The facilities operated in conditions that German industrial managers would have deemed impossible. Housing was primitive, often consisting of tents or hastily constructed barracks. Food was scarce. Yet production continued, driven by necessity and an awareness that failure meant annihilation. Similar scenes played out across the Urals. At Nizhny Tagil, the relocated Kharkov tank factory began producing T-34 seconds in December 1941, just months after the evacuation began. The first tanks rolled off assembly lines in buildings that still lacked roofs. Workers painted the vehicles inside tents, heated by bonfires. Quality suffered initially, with tanks sometimes dispatched to the front, missing non-essential components or proper paint jobs. But the tanks worked, and they kept coming. At the Stalingrad tractor factory, which had not been evacuated due to its distance from the front lines in summer 1941, production continued even as German forces approached the city in autumn 1942. Workers assembled T-34 seconds during the day and fought as militia units defending the factory perimeter at night. Stories emerged of tanks being driven directly from the assembly line into combat, sometimes without ammunition or complete crews. German intelligence struggled to comprehend what was happening. Their pre-war assessments had assumed Soviet industry operated at perhaps 30 to 40% of German efficiency. They had not accounted for the possibility that sheer determination and ruthless prioritization could compensate for technological and organizational deficiencies. The Soviets achieved production increases through methods that horrified German industrial planners when they later learned of them. Soviet factories simplified designs ruthlessly, eliminating any feature that did not directly contribute to combat effectiveness. Between 1941 and 1943, Soviet engineers eliminated over 5,600 parts from the T-34, while reducing the number of components that required precision machining from 861 to 614. The cost of producing a T-34 dropped from 269,500 rubles in 1941 to 193,000 rubles in 1942, and finally to 135,000 rubles by 1943. Production time per tank fell correspondingly. Soviet factories were building T-34 seconds faster than German factories could build Panzer IVs, despite Germany's supposedly superior industrial base. The numbers told a devastating story. In 1942, Soviet factories produced approximately 12,500 T-34 tanks alone, plus thousands of additional light tanks, heavy tanks, and self-propelled guns. By 1943, monthly T-34 production had reached approximately 1,300 units. Total Soviet armored vehicle production that year exceeded 30,000 units. Germany, by contrast, produced roughly 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns in 1942. Even with Albert Speer's armaments miracle of 1943 and 1944, German production never approached Soviet levels. At the peak of German output in 1944, the Reich produced approximately 19,000 armored vehicles. The Soviet Union that same year produced over 29,000, but raw production figures only told part of the story. The real shock for German planners lay in the implications these numbers held for operational planning and strategic decision-making. When General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army became encircled at Stalingrad in November 1942, German commanders faced an unpleasant calculation. The Soviet forces that had executed Operation Uranus, the double envelopment that trapped the Sixth Army, deployed over 1,000 tanks. German intelligence had estimated Soviet tank strength in the region at perhaps 300 to 400 vehicles. The discrepancy revealed a fundamental failure of German intelligence. Not a failure to count individual tanks or locate specific units, but a failure to understand what the Soviet Union was capable of producing and fielding. German planners had based their operational assumptions on production estimates that bore no relationship to reality. In the famous recording made on 4th of June 1942, when Hitler visited Finnish Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim on his 75th birthday, the German dictator revealed his own shock at Soviet industrial capacity. Speaking in an unguarded moment, unaware that a Finnish sound engineer was secretly recording the conversation, Hitler admitted his astonishment at discovering the Soviets possessed 35,000 tanks at the start of Barbarossa. If someone had told me that a country could start with 35,000 tanks, Hitler said, then I would have said, "You are crazy." If one of my generals had stated that any nation had 35,000 tanks, I would have said, "You, my good sir, you see everything twice or 10 times. You are crazy. You are seeing ghosts." Hitler went on to describe a captured Soviet factory, likely one of the tank production facilities near Kharkov that German forces had overrun. "It was unbelievable," he said. "A gargantuan facility. The factory had employed over 30,000 workers in its first shift alone and was designed to expand to 60,000 workers at full capacity. One single tank production facility," Hitler repeated, seemingly still struggling to process what German forces had discovered. The intelligence failure was not simply a matter of underestimating Soviet tank numbers. German analysts had fundamentally misunderstood the Soviet approach to warfare. The Reich's military planners thought in terms of quality, of technological superiority, of the individual excellence of German soldiers and equipment overcoming numerical disadvantages. This approach had worked brilliantly against Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Against the Soviet Union, it was proving catastrophic. Not because German soldiers and equipment lacked excellence, but because the Soviets had embraced a different philosophy entirely. They would trade space for time, men for machines, quality for quantity. They would accept losses that would destroy any Western army because they knew their factories could replace those losses, while German factories could not. The philosophy extended beyond production to design. German tank engineers obsessed over creating the perfect vehicle, a tank that could outfight any opponent in single combat. This approach produced masterpieces like the Panther and Tiger, machines that were technically superior to anything the Soviets fielded. But it also produced tanks that were expensive, complex, and difficult to manufacture in large numbers. The Maybach HL 230 engine that powered the Panther and Tiger II represented German engineering at its finest. Each engine required approximately 180 hours of skilled labor to assemble. Components were individually matched and fitted by craftsmen with years of experience. The result was a powerful, efficient power plant. When it worked, in the field, the sophisticated engine proved temperamental, requiring maintenance regimes that frontline units could rarely provide. Soviet tank engines, by contrast, were designed for mass production from the outset. The V2 diesel engine that powered the T-34 could be assembled by semi-skilled workers following standardized procedures. Parts were interchangeable between engines from different factories, different production runs, even different years. When an engine failed in the field, Soviet mechanics could replace it with whatever was available from the supply depot. German mechanics needed parts calibrated to the specific engine they were repairing. The implications for maintenance and repair compounded over time. A German Panther that broke down far from a repair facility was often abandoned, its crew destroying it to prevent capture. A Soviet T-34 with similar problems could frequently be towed to a field workshop and returned to service within days, sometimes hours. German after-action reports increasingly noted this phenomenon. Tanks that were reported destroyed reappeared in subsequent engagements. Units that intelligence believed had been annihilated reconstituted themselves with remarkable speed. The enemy seemed to possess an endless supply of replacements, both machines and men. At Kursk in July 1943, German forces launched Operation Citadel with approximately 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including nearly 200 of the new Panthers and roughly 140 Tigers. They faced Soviet forces with over 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns in the immediate battle area, with thousands more in reserve. The German attack failed, not because German tanks were inferior in individual combat, they were not. Not because German crews were poorly trained, they were among the best in the world. The attack failed because the Soviets had prepared defenses in depth, had massed artillery and anti-tank guns at unprecedented densities, and had reserves available to counterattack once German forces exhausted themselves. German intelligence before Kursk had estimated Soviet armoured strength in the salient at approximately 1,500 tanks. The actual figure was more than 3 times that number. Soviet deception operations had successfully concealed the true strength of their forces. But even without active deception, German analysts would have struggled to believe the real numbers. They simply could not accept that the Soviets were capable of such production. After Kursk, the strategic initiative passed permanently to the Red Army. German forces would achieve local successes, would demonstrate tactical excellence in countless engagements, would continue to inflict losses on Soviet forces at ratios that seemed to favor the defenders. But none of it mattered. Soviet losses were replaced. German losses were not. The mathematics were remorseless. At the Battle of Prokhorovka, one of the largest tank engagements in history, Soviet forces lost perhaps 300 tanks in a single day's fighting. German losses were far lighter, probably fewer than 5 tanks destroyed outright, with several dozen damaged. By traditional military standards, Prokhorovka was a Soviet disaster. But Soviet factories replaced those 300 tanks within a week. German factories could not have replaced 50 tanks in a month. The Soviet Union could afford to trade tanks at ratios of 6-1, 8-1, even 10-1, and still accumulate strength faster than their opponent. Germany could not afford to trade tanks at any ratio because every German tank lost was irreplaceable. This reality began to penetrate German consciousness gradually. Then, all at once, reports from the front grew increasingly desperate as 1943 progressed. Commanders demanded reinforcements that did not exist. Intelligence officers produced estimates that their superiors refused to believe. Staff planners developed operational concepts predicated on destroying Soviet forces faster than they could be replaced, calculations that proved hopelessly optimistic. By late 1943, the German High Command faced an uncomfortable truth. They had lost the production war before they fully understood it was being fought. Soviet industrial capacity, rebuilt from evacuation, expanded through ruthless prioritization, and driven by a workforce that labored under conditions German workers would never have tolerated, had created an arsenal that German industry could not match. The war continued for another 18 months. German forces fought with skill and determination, extracting a terrible price for every kilometer the Red Army advanced. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The numbers had spoken, and they spoke in Russian. The question that haunted German staff officers throughout 1943 and 1944 was deceptively simple. How had the Soviets done it? How had a nation that German intelligence had dismissed as industrially backward managed to outproduce the most sophisticated manufacturing economy in Europe? The answer lay not in any single factor, but in a constellation of decisions, sacrifices, and organizational choices that German planners had failed to anticipate. Understanding this failure requires examining what the Soviets actually built in those desperate months of 1941 and 1942, and how they built it. The T-34 itself embodied a philosophy alien to German engineering culture. When German technical experts examined captured specimens, they noted with professional disdain the crude welding, the rough castings, the wide tolerances between components. By German standards, the T-34 was a half-finished product, something that would have been rejected by quality control inspectors at any respectable manufacturing facility. But the Germans were applying the wrong standards. The T-34 was not designed to meet peacetime engineering criteria. It was designed to be built quickly, in vast quantities, by workers with minimal training, using machinery that had been dismantled and reassembled after a 1,000-kilometer journey by rail. Every design choice reflected this priority. The sloped armor that gave the T-34 its distinctive profile was not merely a ballistic advantage. It was also easier to manufacture than the complex curved surfaces of German tank designs. The Christie suspension, adapted from American tank designer J. Walter, Christie's work provided excellent cross-country mobility while using relatively simple components. The V2 diesel engine, derived from aircraft engine technology, was powerful and reasonably reliable, but its true virtue was producibility. Soviet engineers had studied American mass production techniques during the 1930s, when the Soviet Union imported entire factories from the United States as part of its industrialization drive. The Stalingrad tractor factory, which would produce T-34 seconds throughout the first year of the German invasion, was essentially a clone of facilities built by American companies. Soviet workers learned Ford's assembly line methods and adapted them to their circumstances. This American heritage proved crucial during the evacuation crisis. Soviet managers knew how to break down a factory into its component parts, ship those parts by rail, and reassemble them at a new location, because they had done exactly this when first establishing their industrial base. The skills developed importing American technology in the 1930s became the skills that saved Soviet industry in 1941. At Nizhny Tagil, where the evacuated Kharkov tank factory became the core of a new production complex, managers implemented innovations that German industrialists would have considered impossible. They established around-the-clock operations with 3 8-hour shifts, pushing workers to the limits of human endurance. They simplified production processes ruthlessly, eliminating any step that did not directly contribute to getting tanks to the front. When rubber for road wheels became scarce, Soviet engineers redesigned the T-34 to use all-steel wheels with internal springs. German tanks with similar wheels would have been considered deficient. The ride was rougher and the wheels wore faster. But the Soviet modification kept production flowing when the alternative was no tanks at all. When machine tools proved insufficient for the volume of work required, Soviet factories adopted semi-automated welding techniques that reduced the skill required for tank assembly. The famous image of T-34 seconds rolling off production lines unpainted was not artistic license. Paint required time and resources that could be devoted to building more tanks. Soviet crews would paint their vehicles in the field if they survived long enough to need a paint job. The human cost of this industrial mobilization was staggering. Workers at Tankograd and other Ural factories labored 12-hour shifts as standard, longer during production emergencies. Housing consisted of dormitories, barracks, and in some cases earthen dugouts. Food rations were barely adequate for survival, let alone the demanding physical labor of tank production. Discipline was enforced through a combination of patriotic exhortation and NKVD surveillance. Women and teenagers filled the gaps left by men conscripted into the Red Army. By 1943, women comprised over half the workforce at many Soviet defense plants. Some were skilled workers who had trained before the war. Others learned on the job, mastering complex tasks in weeks that German apprenticeship programs required years to teach. The results defied German expectations. In January 1942, Soviet tank production had fallen to perhaps 250 vehicles per month, a catastrophic decline from pre-war levels as evacuated factories struggled to resume operations. By December 1942, monthly production had risen to over 1,000 tanks. By mid-1943, Soviet factories were producing nearly 1,500 tanks per month, with the figure continuing to rise through 1944. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German intelligence tracked these figures with growing alarm, though their estimates consistently lagged reality. Reports from Fremde Heere Ost showed a gradual upward revision of Soviet production estimates throughout 1942 and 1943. Each revision prompted disbelief at the operational level, where commanders clung to assumptions that the next offensive would finally exhaust Soviet reserves. General Kurt Zeitzler, who replaced Franz Halder as chief of the German General Staff in September 1942, inherited an intelligence apparatus that systematically underestimated Soviet capabilities. When Zeitzler presented Hitler with revised estimates showing Soviet tank production exceeding German output by a factor of 3 or more, the Führer reportedly dismissed the figures as defeatist propaganda. This pattern repeated throughout the war's latter half. Intelligence officers who produced accurate assessments found their reports ignored or suppressed. Commanders who warned that Soviet strength was greater than assumed were accused of pessimism or cowardice. The German command structure had become incapable of processing information that contradicted its founding assumptions. The disconnect between German perception and Soviet reality reached its zenith during the planning for Operation Citadel at Kursk. German intelligence estimated that the Soviets had concentrated approximately 1,500 tanks in the Kursk salient. The actual figure exceeded 5,000, with thousands more in strategic reserve. Soviet forces had prepared defensive positions to a depth of 300 kilometers, with 8 defensive lines incorporating over 1 million mines, 20,000 artillery pieces, and anti-tank strongpoints at densities never before seen in warfare. German forces achieved tactical penetrations of the Soviet defenses, in some cases advancing 30 to 40 kilometers, but they could not achieve the operational breakthrough that Citadel required. Soviet reserves, drawn from the seemingly inexhaustible production of the Ural factories, counterattacked each penetration before German forces could exploit it. The Tigers and Panthers that German commanders had counted on to shatter Soviet tank formations performed well in individual engagements, but could not be everywhere at once. The aftermath of Kursk revealed a transformed strategic situation. Before the battle, German forces had retained the capacity, however diminished, for large-scale offensive operations. After Kursk, they would fight exclusively on the defensive, trading space for time in a retreat that would end only at Berlin. Soviet commanders recognized what had changed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the most capable Soviet military leader of the war, understood that the correlation of forces had shifted irreversibly. The Red Army now possessed numerical superiority in tanks, aircraft, and artillery that would only grow as the war continued. German forces remained dangerous, capable of inflicting severe losses on attacking Soviet units. But they could no longer win. The campaigns of 1944 demonstrated this new reality with brutal clarity. Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet summer offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center, involved over 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. German forces defending Belorussia possessed perhaps 900 armored vehicles, many of which were older Panzer IVs and assault guns, rather than the Panthers and Tigers that formed the elite of German armored strength. The disparity was not merely numerical. Soviet forces had learned from their earlier defeats, developing combined arms tactics that maximized the effectiveness of their equipment while minimizing the advantages of German qualitative superiority. Massed artillery barrages suppressed German anti-tank guns. Infantry units, often riding on the decks of tanks in a practice called tank descent, provided close protection against German infantry armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. Air cover, provided by an air force that had achieved numerical superiority through production methods similar to those used for tanks, protected Soviet columns from German counterattacks. The Wehrmacht that had once swept from the Bug River to the gates of Moscow in 5 months now retreated the same distance in weeks. Army Group Center lost over 300,000 men killed or captured, along with the bulk of its equipment. German forces in the east would never recover from Bagration. As Soviet forces advanced westward, they overran the sites of their earlier industrial evacuation. In some cases, factories that had been dismantled and shipped east were now being rebuilt in their original locations, a second industrial relocation in reverse. But most of the Ural production complexes remained in place, their capacity now augmented rather than replaced by recovered Western facilities. The scale of what the Soviets had built became apparent to German intelligence officers examining captured documents, interrogating prisoners. A report prepared by Fremde Heere Ost in late 1944 summarized the situation with unusual candor. Soviet tank production capacity now exceeded German capacity by a factor of 4 to 5. Soviet factories could replace tank losses at rates that German industry could not approach even with total mobilization. The war of attrition that German planners had sought to avoid had become the war's defining characteristic, and Germany was losing it decisively. What made this industrial achievement possible? The question fascinated German analysts then and historians since. Several factors converged to create the conditions for Soviet success. First, the Soviet Union had invested heavily in industrial development during the 1930s, with particular emphasis on heavy industry and military production. The 5-year plans, whatever their human costs and economic distortions, had created an industrial base capable of producing modern weapons in large quantities. German planners who dismissed Soviet industry as backward were relying on outdated assessments that failed to account for this transformation. Second, the Soviet system, for all its inefficiencies, proved remarkably effective at mobilizing resources for a single overriding priority. When survival required tank production, the Soviet state could direct labor, materials, and machinery toward that goal with a ruthlessness that democratic societies could not match, and that German authorities, despite their totalitarian rhetoric, proved unwilling to implement until far too late. Third, the geographic extent of the Soviet Union provided strategic depth that no European nation possessed. German forces could occupy Ukraine, Belorussia, and significant portions of Western Russia, while still leaving the industrial heartland of the Urals beyond reach. The evacuation of 1941 exploited this geographic advantage, trading space for the time needed to rebuild production capacity in areas German forces could not threaten. Fourth, Lend-Lease assistance from the United States and Britain, while not decisive for tank production specifically, freed Soviet resources for military manufacturing. American trucks, locomotives, and machine tools allowed Soviet factories to focus on weapons production rather than supporting equipment. Without Lend-Lease, Soviet production figures would have been lower, perhaps significantly so, though probably still sufficient to maintain numerical superiority over German forces. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, the Soviet workforce demonstrated a capacity for sacrifice that German planners had not anticipated. Workers who labored 12-hour shifts in unheated factories, who lived in barracks and ate rationed food, who watched colleagues die of exhaustion and malnutrition, kept producing tanks because they understood the alternative. The Wehrmacht's conduct in occupied Soviet territory, with its mass executions, deliberate, starvation, and enslavement of civilians, eliminated any possibility of Soviet surrender or collaboration on a scale that might have undermined industrial mobilization. German commanders occasionally acknowledged this reality in their private communications. General Gotthard Heinrici, one of the Wehrmacht's most capable defensive tacticians, noted in his diary that the Russians seemed to possess unlimited manpower and material resources. "No matter how many we destroy," he wrote, "more appear. It is as though we are fighting the tide itself." The tide metaphor captured something essential about the Soviet approach to warfare. Individual Soviet tanks were not, by late war standards, technologically superior to their German counterparts. The T-34-85, introduced in 1944 with an 85mm gun, could compete with the Panzer IV, but struggled against Panthers at long range. Soviet tank crews, while improved from the catastrophic early war period, generally, could not match the training and tactical proficiency of their German opponents. But the Soviets had accepted these limitations and built their strategy around them. They would overwhelm German defenses through mass, saturating enemy positions with more targets than German gunners could engage. They would accept losses that would be considered unacceptable by any other standard because their factories could replace those losses and German factories could not. The ratio of losses tells the story. Soviet tank losses throughout the war totaled approximately 96,000 vehicles, including all types. German tank losses on the Eastern Front totaled approximately 32,000. By the traditional calculus of armoured warfare, Germany was winning the tank battle at a rate of 3-1. But Soviet factories produced over 100,000 armoured vehicles during the war years. German factories produced approximately 46,000, and many of those were committed to other theatres or lost before reaching the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union could lose 3 tanks for every German tank destroyed and still accumulate strength faster than its opponent. This was not a comfortable kind of warfare. Soviet tank crews knew their survival rates were poor, that their machines were in some ways inferior to what they faced, that success would be measured in kilometers gained rather than enemies outmaneuvered or outfought. But it was a kind of warfare that worked against an opponent who could not match Soviet production. German military culture, with its emphasis on quality, tactical excellence, and the initiative of junior leaders, had no answer to this industrial onslaught. The virtues that had made the Wehrmacht the most effective fighting force in Europe became irrelevant when the enemy could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Tactical victories accumulated into strategic defeat. By 1945, the correlation of forces had become overwhelming. Soviet forces advancing on Berlin deployed over 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. German forces defending the capital possessed perhaps 1,200 armoured vehicles, many crewed by hastily trained replacements or elderly reservists. The outcome was never in doubt. In the war's final weeks, German commanders, who had once dismissed Soviet industrial capacity as fantasy, confronted its reality directly. Soviet tanks rolled through German cities in numbers that seemed impossible, an endless stream of T-34 seconds, IS-2 heavy tanks, and self-propelled guns bearing down on the heart of the Reich. General Helmuth Weidling, the last commander of Berlin's defense, surrendered the city on 2nd of May 1945. Among his final communications was a request for ammunition and fuel that could not be provided because German production had collapsed entirely. Soviet forces, by contrast, had supplies sufficient to continue operations indefinitely. The war ended not with the dramatic tank battles that German planners had once envisioned, but with the inexorable advance of an enemy who had outbuilt, outproduced, and ultimately overwhelmed them. The 1,000 tanks per month that had seemed impossible in 1942 had become the foundation of Soviet victory. What lessons did German military thinkers draw from this experience? The evidence suggests that many never fully accepted what had happened. Post-war memoirs by German generals emphasized tactical factors, command decisions, Hitler's interference, anything but the fundamental reality that Germany had lost the production war. General Heinz Guderian, whose armoured forces had been central to German strategy throughout the war, wrote extensively about the Eastern Front without ever fully grappling with the implications of Soviet industrial superiority. His memoirs discuss tactical encounters, operational decisions, and command relationships, but treat the production disparity as a background factor rather than the decisive element it became. Others were more candid. General Friedrich von Mellenthin, a staff officer who served throughout the Eastern Campaign, acknowledged in his post-war writings that Germany had fundamentally miscalculated Soviet capacity. "We underestimated them," he wrote, "in every dimension, their industry, their endurance, their willingness to sacrifice. We thought we were fighting a backward nation. We were fighting a colossus." The truth that German high command confronted when Soviet production hit 1,000 tanks per month was not merely a numerical challenge, it was an existential one. Their entire conception of the war, of how it would be fought and won, had been built on assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. They had assumed a short war. The war lasted 4 years. They had assumed Soviet industry was primitive. Soviet industry outproduced German industry by factors of 2, 3, and 4. Over quantity. Quantity, marshalled on a scale Germany could not match, proved decisive. They had assumed that destroying Soviet forces in the field would end the war. Soviet forces reconstituted faster than they could be destroyed. Each of these assumptions had seemed reasonable before Barbarossa. Each proved fatal in practice. The gap between German expectation and Soviet reality was not a matter of degree, it was categorical. The story of Soviet tank production is ultimately a story about the nature of industrial warfare. In such a conflict, the ability to produce weapons matters at least as much as the ability to use them effectively. An army that can replace its losses will eventually defeat an army that cannot, regardless of tactical excellence or technological superiority. Germany learned this lesson too late to change the war's outcome. The Soviet Union learned it through desperate improvisation in the winter of 1941 and 42, when survival itself hung in the balance. The factories they built in the Urals, staffed by workers who labored under conditions that would be considered intolerable by any peacetime standard, became the foundation of victory. When German intelligence officers reported that Soviet production had reached 1,000 tanks per month, they were reporting the moment when the war's outcome became certain. Not because any single battle had been decided, not because any territory had been gained or lost, but because the industrial foundations of Soviet power had been established beyond German reach. The rest was mathematics. Soviet production would rise, German production would plateau and then fall. The correlation of forces would shift inexorably toward the Red Army, and eventually, inevitably, Soviet tanks would enter Berlin. The 1,000 tanks per month was not merely a production target achieved. It was a sentence pronounced on the Third Reich, written in steel and diesel fuel, delivered by an industrial capacity that German planners had dismissed as impossible. They were wrong, and that error, more than any tactical mistake or operational miscalculation, determined the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history. The T-34 that stands today on countless memorial pedestals across the former Soviet Union represents more than a weapon of war. It represents a triumph of industrial mobilization over strategic overconfidence, of production capacity over tactical excellence, of a system that could build 1,000 tanks per month over a system that could not. German generals who survived the war often emphasized what might have been, the battles that could have been won, the decisions that might have changed the outcome. But they were fighting the wrong war, measuring success by the wrong metrics, assuming an enemy who would play by rules they understood. The Soviets understood that modern industrial warfare is won in factories before it is won on battlefields. They built their strategy around that understanding, accepting losses that would have been catastrophic by any other standard, trading lives and machines for time and space, confident that their industrial capacity would ultimately prove decisive. They were right. And when German high command finally comprehended what Soviet production figures meant, it was far too late to change anything. The war had been decided not at Stalingrad or Kursk, but in the factories of the Urals, where exhausted workers assembled T-34 seconds around the clock, where production targets became national imperatives, where the phrase 1,000 tanks per month transformed from impossible to inevitable. History remembers the battles. But the battles were decided by production. And production, in the end, determined everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.